If everybody would please, except for Jim and us, please mute yourselves. We're going to be using the chat box for you to ask Jim questions. And Jim will maybe at various points stop and we can take some of those questions. And then we'll see how it goes, and then we can open it up at the end as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, can you all see my screen? Thumbs
yeah,
up.
I can see it.
Okay, good. So I'd like to give a little announcement for our April program, and that is our very own Dr. Beth Like, and she and her husband, Dr. Ed Like, have a place down in Rodeo, and they've been doing some research on the ecology of this night blooming cactus, Pinus cereus. And so that should be a fascinating talk on April 16th. And so tonight, of course, is Evolution of New Mexico Rare Plant website by Jim McGrath. Jim has been a contract botanist for 16 years, performing threatened and endangered plant surveys on various proposed construction projects, many of which were proposed well pads and pipelines in the oil and gas fields of northwestern New Mexico. He's performed botanical inventories and wetland delineations, specializing in wetland plants during his 25 plus years as a botanist. Jim has an MS in zoology and ecology from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. And mostly as a volunteer, bless your heart, Jim, he collaborated for 6 years with 3 other botanists in rewriting plant descriptions and keys to the genus Carex, the sedges, for the new edition of Flora Neomexicana 3, an illustrated identification manual, part 1, second edition. Kelly Allred was our guest a couple of months ago, and we heard all about that. And Jim had a hand in some of those keys and descriptions. So without further ado, Jim, you can start to share your screen and I'll shut up.
Okay, let me see if I, okay, here's share screen. And we want to do this gizmo. So share.
We practiced this week, so we know we can do it.
Yeah, the practice, as I told you before, we've done that in Albuquerque chapter, and it makes all the difference. So anyway, I want to make sure you can see my PowerPoint.
Looks good.
Okay, well, in that case, let me go and start. And I want to write down the time. Anyway, this is Evolution of the New Mexico Rare Plant website. And I'm going to kind of, if I can minimize these pictures. Forget how you do it. How do I get these pictures out of here?
You can toggle around with view.
There it is. Okay. So anyway, I've titled this Evolution of the New Mexico Rare Plant website. And before I start, though, I do want to thank the Gila chapter for inviting me to make this presentation. At the time, Bill Norris is the one who asked me to do it. And he's one of my Carex colleagues, that the 3 other gentlemen that I worked with on the genus Carex. I've worked with Bill for 6 years on this. Anyway, he asked me to do this, and I didn't realize quite what I was getting into. I'd really gotten quite a ways away from rare plants. So this has brought me back to it. And I want to thank Bill Norris in particular for making the suggestion and that I try to do this. And so, you know, I want to thank him for that because it's got me back into rare plants. So with that, let me move on to the next slide. I want to emphasize that what Bill had told me was the Gila chapter really wanted to know, well, how does a rare plant wind up being on the New Mexico Rare Plant website? How do you define a rare plant? How does this, how is it approved to go on the rare plant website? So that's a lot of what this talk is about. So first of all, defining a rare plant. And what I've kind of discovered is there is no real clear definition. And I've heard Daniela Roth, who is the state botanist, say there is no precise criteria. And sure enough, on the New Mexico Rare Plant website, we don't have a definition. We instead have criteria for inclusion. So you can find that by, all you have to do is Google New Mexico Rare Plants, or you can use that URL and you'll get to the website, and then up at the top, just click on about the rare plant list and go almost all the way to the bottom, and you'll find the criteria for inclusion. But again, no precise criteria, but nevertheless, there are criteria. There's just more than one. And I'm going to mention 4, or probably the principal criteria that we look at when I say we, I mean the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council. And during this talk, I'll be telling you a little bit about the history of the council and how you get onto the council and the procedure it uses to add a species or drop a species from the New Mexico Rare Plant list. But anyway, these are 4 main criteria that we'd be looking at. The first one is range. What's the distribution of this species? Is it a small range, just in a small area like a single mountain range? Or is it wide across several states? The population size, that's important too. Does a plant form huge populations where it grows? Or is it only 2 or 3 plants or somewhere in between? All of that affects how we decide whether it is a rare plant or not. And another feature is habitat. Some plants, a lot of our rare plants have very restricted habitat. And you'll be learning about that in this talk, about some of those restricted habitats. For example, like gypsum outcrops or saline, what we call cienagas, which are alkaline wetlands. Or it could be a wide habitat. That is, you get certain species that basically will grow in a particular type of, let's say in a conifer forest. And let's say it could be found in openings and slopes in conifer forest. Well, folks, that's a lot of the habitat in the conifer forest. So for a species like that, you could call it a habitat generalist. It doesn't seem to be too picky, just the fact that it's got to be a forest. And then the 4th one is vulnerability. This turns out to be ultra important, especially as we get closer and closer, seeing climate change breathing down our necks. So what it amounts to, the presence or absence of threats to the existence of the species. Some cases, we don't detect any really serious threats. In other ones, like these saline wetlands I mentioned, are very vulnerable to destruction. And of course, there's an awful lot of demand for water in New Mexico, especially with drought. So that habitat that's a serious threat. And sometimes there isn't very serious threats. So those are some of the criteria, but it's actually the combination of these, or in particular, we'll look at maybe all 4 criteria. There may be one of those is really especially important. And that is the trigger that overall might make the botanist decide, yeah, we're going to call this a rare plant. Okay, so now I am going to illustrate some of these. So here's an example of one that you're familiar with. This is Metcalf's penstemon. Penstemon metcalfii. It's got a small range. It occurs in the Black Range. So that's not a very large range. That's just one mountain range. And it occurs on cliffs, north-facing slopes. That's a relatively restricted habitat in the conifer forest. Anyway, that one is a rare plant. So let's try another one. Now here's another plant that has a small range like Metcalf's penstemon, but it has a broad habitat and it's common where it grows. So this one is Wooten's buckwheat or Eriogonum wootonii. It occurs in the Sacramento, White, and Guyanus Mountains. And you can find it on openings and slopes in conifer forest, just like I described before. That's a kind of a habitat generalist, and it's common. But the catch is that range is relatively small. And because of that, in this, there's a lot of endemic, I'm going to be using this term endemic, and I'll explain it in a little bit. But there's a lot of species like this that occur in the Sacramento Mountains and White Mountains of central New Mexico. Okay, so that's an example of one. It's still a rare plant, even though it's common, because of that small range. All right, here's another one. As Don was just mentioning, next month's program is about this species. This is the night blooming cereus or Pennia cereus gregii variety gregii. I'm specifically identifying the gregii, the variety on this particular one on the rare plant website. It's not the other variety that is considered the rare taxon. We'll call this a rare taxon because it's specifically this variety. Anyway, this one has a relatively wide range. It goes from about Texas to Arizona. It's still somewhat restricted. And it has a broad, more or less broad habitat. It sort of occurs in sandy to silty gravelly soils, in Chihuahuan desert scrub or desert grassland. But the catch with this one, I mean, it's never locally common though. So that's a factor that leans us towards rarity, declaring this a rare plant. But more important is the vulnerability to things like collecting. So for example, it's used in religious activities. Collectors may grow it for gardening purposes, both commercial and not. And so there has been a lot of destruction of this plant species in the past. I don't know how bad it is now, but, and then of course it is pollinated by sphinx moths. And, you know, and you never can tell when it's got a particular, basically it's got such a unique floral habit where all of the plants in an area will all flower on the same night, and the flowers are only there for one night. What an amazing, interesting plant. But anyway, the fact that it has those pollinators, if something were to happen to those pollinators, like some kind of a infection could make it vulnerable to extinction. So anyway, that one is state endangered. Let's go to another one. This is the Peco sunflower, Helianthus paradoxus. It is actually federally threatened. Well, in this case, it has a fairly wide range, but only a few locations. And that's because it has a very narrow and vulnerable habitat. These saline desert springs, we call them cienagas. And they can be very abundant, as you can see in the photograph. It can be real abundant where they do grow. But those habitats are vulnerable because of drought and climate change. And then humans extracting the water from the water table, drying out a lot of these cienagas. And then there's human abuses on these cienagas and also invasion from invasive weeds. This one's federally threatened. So it's the vulnerability of this narrow type habitat that gets this to be a rare plant. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council. It was born in 1998. And the council was, the need for the council were promoted by two guys, Bob Savinsky, who at the time was the New Mexico State botanist, and Charlie McDonald, who was the Fish and Wildlife Service botanist based in Albuquerque. But his job, by the way, was eliminated. Well, I'll pick it up a little later when he becomes the website editor. But the bottom line, he started out as a fish and wildlife service botanist. And then later on, after he lost that job, it was eliminated. He went over to U.S. Forest Service became the regional botanist based in Albuquerque for the Southwest region. And so those two guys promoted it. Bob Stavinsky was the first chairman. And in 1999, the website is created. And in fact, if you try to use the website and cite it in the publication, you use that 1999 date in citing the New Mexico Rare Plant website, using it to this day. So now I want to tell you about some of the decisions that were made in the original council in the late 90s. But before I do, I want to introduce some terms. And so the first one is endemic. Probably a lot of you are familiar with this term. All it means is a species is native to a specific area or region. If you go to the criteria for inclusion, you will see that they list that the species could be restricted to a specific geographic feature, like a mountain range. In this case, I mentioned Black Range, or a geologic feature like gypsum outcrops, or it can be restricted to a subset area of a phytogeographic region, like, for example, the northern Chihuahuan Desert. But actually, folks, even though it says that in the criteria for inclusion, endemic is really, we use that pretty loosely. What it really means, you say it's endemic to a certain area, it just means it does not occur outside that area. So for example, you got a plant species that is only found in Grant County, New Mexico, you can say it's endemic to Grant County, which of course is a political area rather than one that pertains to geology and geography. Okay, so that's endemic. Let's go, and I'm going to give a couple of examples. And these you're familiar with because I noticed Don had a picture of Scrophularia micrantha, the membranous figwort on the right. And the one on the left is Agastache cana, grayish-white giant hyssop. And they're both regional endemics in your part of the world. So I did list basically a little bit about the Agastache, which is the giant hyssop. And that one occurs in granite cliffs and canyons. And it extends basically in southwestern New Mexico, extends a little bit into Texas and Arizona. And the Scrophularia is apparently restricted to mountains in southwestern New Mexico, occurring on north-facing igneous cliffs and talus slopes, a fairly restricted type habitat. So both of those are regional endemics, southwestern New Mexico. All right, now I'm going to introduce another term. And oh, by the way, you didn't seriously think I would go through this program without showing the sedge. And of course, we've got one right here. This is Carex ultra, the Cochise sedge. And I want to introduce the term peripheral. All that is talking about is a species that's widely distributed outside New Mexico, but it's actually rare in New Mexico. Or as I say in here, found only at its extreme edges. Actually, they don't necessarily have to be at the extreme edges, but point is they're rare in New Mexico, widely distributed outside of it. And in effect, what we're saying is that in New Mexico, this particular species is at the edge of its range or the periphery of its range. And that's where the term peripheral comes in. Carex ultra is a good example of that. Most of its distribution is in Arizona, extends into Mexico, but there's only two known collections. I shouldn't say two known populations because one of those collections was made in 1977. And I need to get back there and find out if that population still exists. And they're right inside the Arizona state line. So this is a good example of a peripheral species. So let's go to this one. Another sedge. The term I want to use is disjunct population. And that is similar to peripheral, except you got a species with a population that is significantly more separated from a more widespread population of the same species. And Carex amplifolia, the big leaf sedge, is a classic example of that because it occurs essentially only in the Black Range of New Mexico. And the nearest populations are actually in California, not in Arizona, we know of. And it also is widespread and actually dominant in wetlands in Washington and Oregon. But here we got this population in the Black Range, so we call that a disjunct population because of the wide separation. Now, I want to come down to these original New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council decisions. I've listed 4. There may be more that if you read the criteria for inclusion, because I think it's more or less the same criteria, except these 4 that I've listed here have now changed in the last couple of years. So, for example, the first one is, the first decision that was made was that the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council in the late 90s decided we're not going to count peripheral species and disjuncts. The reason for that is they didn't consider them rare because they're not outside of New Mexico. They may be in New Mexico, but as a population as a whole, they are not rare, so we don't count them. That was this decision back in the late 90s. Another thing they did was establish what we call the 100-mile rule. They decided that a regional endemic is a rare plant if the entire population is contained within a distance of 100 miles. And even if it's really common or abundant within those 100 miles, we still call it a rare plant. So that was a key factor. If we found the whole population is within 100 miles, that's a rare plant automatically. Third thing I'm mentioning here is the red code. That was used to define endangerment. The 3 letters there, RED, stand for rarity, endangerment, and distribution. And for each one of those features, there was a scale of 1 to 3. But as it turned out that even though we put that on a number of species on the Rare Plant website, nobody ever used the red code. And so it was finally dropped in 2019. And beyond that, I'm not going to talk anymore about it. Nobody ever used it. And now we're definitely discontinuing it as of a couple of years ago. And then finally, another thing we decided, because of the definition of a rare plant, that we decided, that we were only concerned with rare plants in New Mexico. We don't count the peripherals and disjuncts. Well, because of that, they decided not to include everything that was on agency-sensitive species lists. For example, some species did not meet the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council criteria for rarity, so we didn't count them. So one classic example would be the state endangered Great Plains lady's tresses, which is Spiranthes magnetempora. That one occurs in the Blue Hole Cienega and a few other places in the state, but it's essentially a peripheral. It's much more widespread in the Great Plains. So it didn't meet our definition of rarity, so we didn't count it, but it's actually state endangered. It was before the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council formed, but yet we didn't count it as a rare plant. And so I'm saying that all 4 of these have changed, and I'll be talking about how they changed. Actually, I've already more or less mentioned, I'll be explaining the changes that have been made toward the end of the talk. Okay, so another thing I want to emphasize, that the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council made an incredibly far-sighted decision. Back in the late 90s, the World Wide Web was really starting to get going. And the other states, Utah, Arizona, and Colorado, and also 2, I have 5 publications. They're binders with replaceable pages in them. And those were published by those 3 states, Arizona, Colorado, and what's the other one, Utah, plus 2 districts of the BLM in New Mexico. And those publications, the last one was dated 1998. But in any event, I decided we weren't going to make a publication. We're going to do a website. Well, folks, I can't begin to tell you what a far-sighted thought that was. As you well know, the web and computers, there's so much of what we do with the World Wide Web and the websites, it's unbelievable. But anyway, the advantage of it was that in the world of plants, there's always changes taking place as new studies are, botanists study plants and new populations are discovered. Botanists publish new papers and describe new species. So every couple of years, we really had to meet again and we decide which species needed to be added or dropped. So having a website, that turned out to be perfect for that. And also, by not having a publication that we had to have a deadline to complete, we could take our time adding photos, taxon reports, which we now call abstracts, drawings and maps, and all of that stuff could be updated as we needed to without worrying about some deadline. So that was real important. Now, I want to mention that the new New Mexico Rare Plant website was then developed, starting basically in 1999. And you got to emphasize that this is primarily volunteers. I say primarily because we did have to have people that were full-time employed that were working on rare plants. And certainly the website editors, who I'm going to talk about in a bit. But those people were paid, but basically it's volunteers. And the website you see today, there have been a total now of 27 authors of those taxon reports and 59 people that have contributed photographs to the Rare Plant website. Okay, I want to get to the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council decision-making. And Don, I think you had indicated that you wanted to take questions halfway through the talk. So is this a good time to do that?
Yes, if there's one or two questions, that would be great.
I don't see anything in the chat. Tell them that you don't see anything in the chat.
Yeah, there's nothing in the chat box. So I would say,
Well,
go ahead.
okay, so let me go ahead and proceed with the talk. And so what I wanted to introduce now was, because what I picked up from what the Gila chapter was interested in knowing is how do we make these decisions about adding and dropping species? So now I'm going to talk about that. Well, first of all, let's talk about the council qualifications. And I can still remember the first time I contacted Charlie McDonald. He was the web council chair at the time. And I can't remember if I did it by email or whether I did it by, I can't remember if I did it by email or by phone. But either way, I talked to Charlie and he said, all you got to do is show up and you're on the council. Or if it was email, and he said, if you got an email from the New Mexico Rare Plant listserv, which is the New Mexico Rare Plant discussion group, you got an email about this because you enrolled in it, then you're on the council. It's that simple. So there are no requirements. That said, a species basically is nominated based on field experiences and or the literature, but it's primarily the professional botanists that would be at these New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Councils, which would include academics like Dr. Kelly Allred and Tim Lowry. They are the major players, and basically the decisions really kind of went through them. I know for my part of the meetings that I went to, nearly all of them, I was just basically an observer. So I got to emphasize that it's really the professional botanists and the ones that have been out in the field that help us make those decisions. And we just had a Rare Plant Technical Council meeting on February 26th, and we had a discussion. And well, first we had a plant was nominated for either being dropping or adding. And we then discussed it. And then based on the discussion, after that, we hold a vote and decide yes or no. I think in earlier times, when the Rare Plant Technical Council meet, I think it was more or less, I don't think we really held votes. I think they sort of came to agreements, it seemed like to me, mainly, again, the professional botanists in the agencies and in academia. Anyway, so that's how the decisions are made. And so now I want to talk about adding a species. So I'm going to give some examples. On the first one, typically a new species is described in the literature. And it's typically a restricted area. So, I mean, for example, I mean, somebody goes out and they've sort of found a plant and then they've researched it in some degree, looking at specimens of closely related species, where they occur, and analyzing the characters of the two possible species. They finally conclude, hey, you know what, this one's a new species. But basically, this researcher's probably only looked at, you know, a relatively small amount of specimens for this new species. So it'll typically be in a relatively small area. So when it's first introduced, it's going to be, it's because of that small range, it'll wind up being a rare plant because we don't know enough information about it. Okay, so I noticed I didn't list any species as examples. That's because my next slide, I have two that I'll talk about. But anyway, just mention these two other situations just to give examples. One that popped up on this last meeting we had on February 26th, Bob Savinsky proposed Berlandiera McBuckii to be added to the rare plant list. Well, this one was kind of overlooked. It looked to me like, you know, that, in fact, I went to the SciNet to see how many plant specimens of this species are actually, you know, and SciNet is connected to about, I don't know how many herbaria, it's well over 100, I'm sure. And there were only 8 specimens. So it's clearly rare, but it's mostly, it's a Guadalupe Mountains endemic. So most of them, the specimens are in Texas, but there are about 2 are in New Mexico. So I think our group basically had ignored it. And then Bob caught it and said, hey, you know what? We need to make this a rare plant. And so it will be, and I've been assigned the duty of writing up an abstract on it. So I'll have to do some research for it. Now here's another, so that was an overlooked species. Now here's another one. So once you got a species that is not considered rare, but the habitat it occurs in is now threatened by human activity or some environmental phenomenon. So one of the species we're still working on, this is part of the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy. This species, Caladium californicum, a California sawgrass, is pretty widespread from Texas to California, but it only occurs in these kind of alkaline type wetlands, like, you know, they're sort of similar to the Pecos sunflower, a highly vulnerable type habitat. So when we meet on March 31st, we'll be considering this species. I'm not sure if we'll consider it rare or not, but it's sort of on the fence there, and we'll have to discuss whether it is rare or not. But that's an example of one that probably isn't really rare, but we might count it because its habitat is very kind of endangered. All right, so let's go and look at those 2 examples. So these 2 I especially want to talk about. The first one on the left is the cloudcroft scorpion weed, or the Phacelia crowdcroft-densis. So there's a story behind this one. Turned out there's a professor from BYU, Dr. Atwood, evidently studying Phacelia and looking at specimens, and he just finally kind of noticed. And I think it was most of these specimens had been, I think they were identified as Phacelia integrifolia, but I haven't documented that for sure. That's what I recall. And he decided, you know what, this is different species. And it occurs in the Sacramento Mountains of central New Mexico. And at the time, it's an annual plant. So he published this paper, it's in the Sacramento Mountains, He identified, he collected some specimens. He also annotated some. And so, you know, there was basically locations where these were found. So Bob Savinsky wanted to verify its existence. So he went out looking at the places where Atwood said he collected or reported these species from, these specimens. Bob Savinsky couldn't find them. And I was, at the time, I had already organized some rare plant field trips. And on this particular one, we were going to do a rare plant field trip, and we decided to make this the focus of it. So I remember researching some of those specimens that Atwood annotated. And we went back to, I can think of at least 2 locations. And Bob Savinsky had already been there, and he didn't find them. So, you know, we sure didn't think we would find them. But we got to this site. It's on the main highway between Cloudcroft and Alamogordo. And it basically, I think it was dry travertine rock. And we found the plant, this plant that Atwood had just described as a new species. So I can't begin to tell you the joy I had taking photographs of this, because I knew Bob Savinsky and Dr. Lowry, the curator of the herbarium, they didn't think we'd find this. And I sure didn't either. But when I sent them the photographs, and I think Bob Savinsky's response was, "So you found it." Anyway, a lot of satisfaction there, folks. Again, this one was added because a small range, because he only found it in that small area of Sacramento Mountains. And so it simply depends on more research, people out in the field to look for that species after once it's been published. The one on the right is Muilla lordsburgana. That is a new species that has recently been published by Patrick Alexander. And I particularly want to use this one because I've mentioned Daniela Roth. She's an estate botanist. Bob Savinsky has been a state botanist for, I think, 22 years, and then he retired and he now works as an independent contractor. But he has been involved with the Rare Plant, New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council for the entire 23 years. And Charlie McDonald was the website editor, as I'll mention in a little bit, for like 12 years with Fish and Wildlife. But I want to mention Patrick Alexander as I mean, there's other botanists that are involved, but Patrick has taken a lot of photographs of New Mexico rare plants. And I think he has written up a number of abstracts in the last 10 or 15 years. So he's been pretty active. And in this case, he published this as a new species, Muilla lordsburgana. And it's closely related, it's close relative. Actually, I think it's in California. So it's possible that this could have been a disjunct population of that same one. But Patrick did his due diligence. I mean, I've kind of looked at the paper he published, and he documented the specimens. He's got a map showing where each plant was found. It's northeast of Lordsburg in deep sandy soils. It grows with, it's very highly type of disturbed habitat with a lot of invasive plants like red stem fillery that grow in this habitat. But he said he looked in similar habitat that he found that this plant was growing in within about 100, and I think it was 120 kilometers, which is like 50 miles. Man, that's pretty good. He covered that much and could not find, he's only got 2 localities, I think. And so very restricted range. And so he published this, and he, of course, did his due diligence, was able to determine some characteristics of the flower that he was able to document that distinguished it for sure from Muilla coronata in California, and therefore we had a new species. So hats off to Patrick, done a good job on that. So those are 2 examples of added species. Now let's talk about dropping a species. Well, the most likely way that this can happen is the species can be dropped into synonymy. And this happens a lot. In other words, a plant is described and we add it to the website, and somebody comes along and publishes a paper and he looks at this species and its most closely related one, and he decides, you know what, these really aren't two species, it's really the same one. And usually the more closely related one, the one with the larger distribution, has probably been described earlier. So that's the name that's retained. And the rare plant that we thought was a rare plant now is dumped into synonymy. It's not a rare plant because it's a different species, and botanists got it wrong. And so these kinds of things happen a lot in the world of botany. So, and I'm going to give you an example here in a minute. And now I'm just going to mention one other example of dropping a species. Then I'll show you a couple examples, that is with pictures. The species could be more common or widespread than originally thought, and it's not particularly threatened in its habitat. So one that we discussed online, thanks to Patrick Alexander, who, by the way, is a BLM botanist. He is a PhD, Dr. Patrick Alexander. And he advised us this plant was pretty common, and therefore is much more common or widespread than we originally thought. And so I think it had popped up on the New Mexico rare plant strategy list. And so it was dropped. We decided we're not going to count it as a rare plant. So that one was then Xanthissima visitum, just more widespread than originally thought, and it isn't threatened, so we drop it. All right, now, the two examples. All right, this first one on the left is the San Mateo penstemon, or Penstemon pseudoparvus. Well, it turns out that I worked in 2018 at Grassy Lookout in the San Mateo Mountains. And so if you look up the rare plant description of this rare plant, it's an endemic to the San Mateo and Magdalena Mountains of central New Mexico, and that's where Grassy Lookout was found. And so anyway, I spent that summer at Grassy, and it turns out this species supposedly occurred right about that elevation in openings in conifer forest. And sure enough, I saw the populations of the species. And I always understood that the closely related species doesn't occur in this mountain range, only this one does. So eventually, and it was actually Forest Service sensitive. So the Forest Service has these real picky rules about collecting Forest Service sensitive species. But I was allowed to collect one. So I collected a specimen, but it took me many months, which happens every year. I don't get around to looking at my specimens until winter. And I finally looked at this and I keyed it out and I go, this is not Penstemon pseudoparvus, it's Penstemon alleganthus. And it's clearly alleganthus. And so that is when it occurred to me. I contacted my colleague, Carrick's colleague, Glenn Rink in Arizona. He's studying Penstemon these days. And he told me, well, they recently published Flora of North America volume that includes Penstemon. And sure enough, I looked it up and I ordered a copy of volume 17. Publication date is 2019. And in there, I go to Penstemon alleganthus, and there's quite a 2 or 3 or 4 sentences in which Dr. Craig Freeman describes the fact that he looked at a bunch of specimens from these 2 mountain ranges of the 2 species, and finally concluded that they are indistinguishable, and therefore Penstemon pseudoparvus is a synonym of Penstemon alleganthus. And so with that, I proposed, along with Daniela, proposed that we drop the species at our February 26th meeting. And you can't beat a publication like that. And then what I found was exactly corroborating it, because Penstemon alleganthus wasn't supposed to be in those San Mateo Mountains. So because that's the earlier described species, Penstemon alleganthus, that's what it'll be called. But this is not a rare plant because it really is a more widespread species. Now, the one on the right is the La Jolla prairie clover, Dahlia scariosa. And this one's got an interesting history. This is another one of these New Mexico rare plant conservation strategy species that we are currently dealing with. But I can remember when I first started going to the technical council meetings, Dahlia scariosa was listed as a rare plant because the entire population was within the 100 miles. And, you know, where it occurs is in central New Mexico from about Bosque del Apache or so on up north towards the north side, towards Bernalillo and perhaps towards Santa Fe somewhere. And anyway, it was less than 100 miles. So it's abundant. It can be found on roadsides. It grows in very sandy soil. It's not threatened, but because it's within that 100 miles, it was decided to be a rare plant. And then something happened. You know, people find new populations, new specimens are collected that expand the range of species. And so this one now, all of a sudden we discovered, and I was trying to determine today when exactly this change took place. But we dropped Dahlia scariosa as a rare plant because we found that the range was greater than 100 miles and it's common, not threatened. So we dropped the species. And now with the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy, it's back on the rare plant list. And on March 31st, we're going to have to decide whether we'll keep it as a New Mexico rare plant or drop it again. So it's kind of an interesting history with that one. So now with that, I just want to mention real quickly, I've already mentioned these people, the history of the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council from 2001 to 2013. Charlie McDonald was the website editor. As I said, he started out with Fish and Wildlife Service as a botanist, then wound up with the job with U.S. Forest Service Southwest Region, the regional botanist. But he served as the website editor, and I think he basically did it on his job. And that was really crucial because, you know, to maintain the website, that needed to be done. And I don't know that if we didn't have people that could actually do this and not go broke doing it, I don't know that the website would have survived as long as it has. And then after Charlie retired, Daniela Roth became the state botanist. She replaced Bob Savinsky as the state botanist, and she has been the website editor ever since. And so I just want to emphasize how important these people are: Charlie McDonald, Daniela Roth, and Bob Savinsky. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about this New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy. This kind of brings us up to a new era in the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council. This talk is not designed to tell you about the Rare Plant Conservation Strategy. I'm just going to introduce it. If you want to hear about the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy, contact Daniela Roth, and she has a program, which she did for Albuquerque chapter in November, about the Rare Plant Conservation Strategy. So have her do a talk for you, and she will tell you all about it. But I'm going to mention a few things about it, though. First of all, in 2017 was published a document, 85-page document, which basically forms the framework and reference for priority actions by government agencies like BLM, Forest Service, the state. And there's the URL, but just Google New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy and you'll get it. So, and then as part of this conservation strategy, the Rare Plant Technical Council is now one of 5 working groups of this conservation strategy. So let's move on to this one. And this is where some of these changes I talked about earlier have now taken place. And it's a combination of this New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy and meetings of the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council as we try to resolve these issues. When I say the issues is that the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy, that 85-page document lists 235 species that we call the strategy species. Well, those species are all New Mexico rare plants. They're now on the website. And when they did so, 200 of those met the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council standards for rare, but 35 of them didn't necessarily so. Things that have changed as a part of the strategy, the rare plant conservation strategy. All agency listed species are considered strategy species, therefore they are all rare plants. So that exclusion back in the late 90s, where some agency species were not counted on the rare plant list, if they're listed by any agency, they are now rare plants on the New Mexico Rare Plant website. So that's change number one. And anyway, we're currently reviewing the 35 species of strategy species that aren't recognized by the old definition of New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council criteria for rare. And we've already gone through about half of them. We dropped a bunch of them. We've retained some as rare plants. But in any event, the other decision, this was made at the February 26th meeting, and finally laid to rest the differences between the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council rare species and the strategy species. We eliminated the 100-mile rule. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, it's pretty arbitrary to use that distance. And it restricts things. So now we have it's more flexible in making decisions by not having this 100-mile rule. And so as an end result of eliminating that 100-mile rule, adding the agency species, we can now say as of February 26th of 2021, that the strategy species and the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical species are all synonymous. They're all the same thing. There's no difference between the strategy species because we have adjusted the criteria for rare on the website as of February 26th. And so let's go on to this one. Oh, there's one other thing we decided. We decided to create a list of peripherals because, as I said, there was a lot of discussion about dropping this 100-mile rule. And a number of people are concerned about plants that are rare in New Mexico. Even though they're widespread outside the state, shouldn't we count some of those as rare plants? And Bob Savinsky did a little research and he discovered that you could get about 265 species. He counted 265 species using his criteria, and I'm not going to go into details, but 265 species that would be rare in New Mexico, widespread or common outside the state. So 265 species, there's no way the New Mexico Rare Plant website could add those and then have pictures and abstracts of all these species when we depend on volunteers to do it. It's just way too many. So we decided on February 26th, we would just create a list of species with no abstracts, no photographs, nothing else, just the list. And it will be maintained by Natural Heritage New Mexico. By the way, Natural Heritage New Mexico is based in Albuquerque at UNM, and they are a major partner with in the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy. They basically, I'm not sure how to say it, there are other partners, but they have I think Daniela wrote the actual 85-page document. But in any event, Natural Heritage New Mexico is heavily involved. Anyway, they're basically deal with data management. And so they will be developing a list of these peripheral species. And you may think, I know some people at the meeting on February 26th seem to think it's not a good idea. Nobody's going to pay attention to it. Well, I personally like it because I would like to know if there are species. That would be a nice list to go to. If you're looking, if you want to know plant species that are rare in the state. If you're an agency person, you might be very interested in how rare certain plant species are, even if they're widespread outside the state, that they still deserve protection because they're part of our flora and we want to keep our flora. We don't want to lose species as part of our flora just because they're widespread outside the state. So I think the list is a good idea. Okay, now I'm going to move on I'm going to talk a little bit, about two items in the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy rather briefly. You'll notice I put down the Rare Plant Conservation Scorecard. I'm going to talk about that when we go. I want to illustrate the website, which is brand new. It's only been up for a year. So I want to illustrate that before I end this talk. But anyway, I'll talk about the scorecard when I get to that. In the meantime, they have this feature called IPAs, or important plant areas. And what that is, those are places in New Mexico with a high biodiversity of species, or they're the last remaining places of the most endangered species. You'll notice I listed the URL. Just go and Google the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy. When that pulls up, I am now going to kick out of my PowerPoint for a bit so I can share another. Don, do I have to stop share, or how do I get to the other one? Do I just, I kick out of this one and then do I stop share and then share again? How does that work? Don, can you hear me?
Sorry about that. Yeah, you can stop share
And then start a new
and
share.
then, okay, now start a share screen with your other one.
I lost it. I got to go and I got to go get it. I thought I had it here.
We've got it if you don't.
No, I've got it. I just have to go get it. I had it there and I evidently kicked it out. I've done this so many times, it pops up right away. Okay, so here it is. So I just want to illustrate this a little bit. And I will share this map. And to do that, where's the share thingy? Oh yeah, it's this must be it. No, where's the
You have to move your mouse in order for it to show up.
yeah, I have
Usually down at the bottom in green.
oh, the share screen. Okay, yeah, there it is. Okay, I had to go back to this. And this is the one I want. Okay, so share. And then I'm going to do this. Can everybody see that map?
We see it.
Okay, all I want to do is mention about this. These are these important plant areas. And all they are is we've taken the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy species, which are the rare plants, or that is this New Mexico Natural Heritage New Mexico produced this. And so what it does is the dark green ones are areas where there's a high concentration of especially high concentration of these rare plants. And so you can, anyway, there's like 133 of them. And you can go to the Rare Plant Conservation Strategy, which by the way is a PDF. If you go to that same, if you go to the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy, if you Google that, you have to download the PDF to get to this 85-point document, 85 page document. And anyway, in Appendix C, it will list all of these IPAs and it'll tell you how many numbers of species are in that IPA, but it will not tell you which species. That apparently it's a security issue and you have to contact Daniela Roth to find out. So now I'm going to stop share and go back to this. And you'll notice Daniela Roth's email address below. I don't know if she'll give you the names of the species for a particular IPA. You'll have to convince her that you are a reliable person and meet the standards of security. So anyway, that's all I want to say about IPAs. Now I want to, let's go to one more feature I want to talk about before I go to the website. Okay, I'm going out on a limb here. I'm saying New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council going forward is it's more now an emphasis on conservation than it is on rarity. I am not speaking on behalf of the council, and I am not speaking on behalf of Daniela Roth, but just from the dialogue and discussion that's taken place at the February 26th meeting, and then the fact that so much is being, this is now, the Rare Plant website is tied in to the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy. It's pretty obvious to me it's more important about the conservation of these rare plants than whether or not it's technically rare. So this is what I see happening. If Daniela Roth is in the audience, she can correct me. But in any event, I've got one more slide here. And then I want to illustrate the website, because the website has been a work in progress for several years. This is a new website that was introduced on April 1st of 2020. It's only a year old. And it's a vast improvement of what it has been before. And one of the major features of the new website is that the database is maintained by Natural Heritage New Mexico. So as I said, they're a major player on the New Mexico Rare Plant website. And the new website is far more user-friendly and faster, and it's far easier and faster for website editing, which is important for Daniela. And before her, Charlie McDonald. I used to hear complaints about how long it took to post something or delete something or drop something. And now it's really easy from what Daniela has told me. So now with that, I'm going to stop share again. I can figure out where the stop share gizmo is. Let me think.
I think you've already stopped share. Now you can start share with your next one.
Okay, and this time I've got it. Can everybody see this? This is the New Mexico Rare Plant website. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay, I want to say a few things about this, make it kind of quick and dirty. But first of all, you just look at the topics up at the top, click on a rare plant list. So you go down there and you're going to see a bunch of drop-down boxes. You'll see that you can type in the scientific name or the common name to look up a species. I never do that. I simply go to the strategy species and scroll down. It's real easy. It goes real fast. And you can find the species, especially if you're good at spelling, you can find the species. And then what you do, I'm going to illustrate this in a bit, but I want to talk about these drop-down boxes. So you can see there's a drop-down box for drop species. So every time we have drop species, look how many drop species we got. There's a lot of them. And there, and if there was an abstract or a taxon report form that was developed, it's still there. So if it was important enough to add it at one time, it's still got relevance. And so you may want to check those if you're interested, but the rare plants are now the ones that we call strategy species. You'll see the list of counties that's in a drop-down box. And I'm going to mention a little bit about these drop-down boxes down below. You see where it says conservation ranks? Folks, that stuff is really, really important for the professional botanists. And the New Mexico Rare Plant Conservation Strategy depends a lot on these rankings. And I'm just not going to get into a lot of detail on them. I think for what you're doing, for your interest, to just know a little bit about it. But basically, there's the one on the left, beginning with G, stands for global. And there's a scale of 1 to 5. And the lower the number, the more rare the species is. And the ones on the right that begin with S are state ranked conservation ranks. and Natural Heritage New Mexico creates those. They are also on a scale of 1 to 5. And in the rare plant conservation strategy, what's really important are G1, G2, G3, S1, S2, and S3. I'm not going to go into the names of those. You can go into about the rare plant list, scroll down, and a lengthy discussion of what these symbols mean. But those ranks are very important in determining rare plants for agency people, and in determining the rare plant conservation strategy. It had to be how it's worked out, I'm not quite sure. I just know these are really important, but for the average user, I think just a general idea of what they do, what these things mean is a good idea. So I'm going to give, but before I do, I'm going to go to the overall conservation status, because I forgot to do this when I was practicing this earlier, and it's important to do this. That overall conservation status is based on this scorecard, and I'm not going to illustrate the scorecard. You want to read about it, get Daniela to talk about the rare plant conservation strategy, or get that 85-page document, and it'll explain it to you. But it's extremely elaborate, mathematical formulas, graphs, and so on, a deep analysis of each species. And then they result in this overall conservation status. And those are the 4 categories. None means that the data was so inadequate they couldn't give you an overall conservation status. But effectively conserved, those 4 categories effectively conserved would be the ones that are in best shape, and then weakly conserved presumably would be the least conserved. And so, and these are these statuses developed through that scorecard, which is a huge amount of number crunching. But I do want to emphasize that if you download, and I'll show you where you can do it here in a minute, but if you download the scorecard, the first thing that pops up are the boxes. There's lists. There's list A, B, list A, list B, list C, and list D. And the first thing that pops up, you download the scorecard that tells you what those mean. So list A is the data is good enough to give you a high level of confidence, either a moderate to high level of confidence, to say what their conservation status is. List B has enough data to give a conservation status, but the confidence level is low. So what they did was that if it was ranked, if the analysis showed it to be effectively conserved, it dropped it 2 notches. So effectively conserved would pop up as under conserved, or moderately conserved would pop up as weakly conserved. So what it's telling you is, and that's list B. List C, there's not enough data to even give a conservation status. So if you do mess with the scorecard or these conservation status, when you're looking at the species, make sure you check the scorecard lists A, B, and C, and D. And I won't talk about list D. Those are basically stable species. I'm not going to get into it, but those other 3 are they're effectively conserved in the judgment of Natural Heritage New Mexico if they're on list D. I don't want to get into the details, but you need to know that if you're using the conservation status, which of those lists your species is on. Because if it's on list B, really don't have much data. And especially if you get list C, there's not enough data to even give you a conservation status. So I wanted to talk about that. Now, a couple examples and then we're done. I want to illustrate how this works. You can click, I'm going to click on G1 and S1 and Grant County. So these would be the 2 rarest plants in Grant County because they're both G1. And what that means, just roughly saying that there's less than 5 occurrences globally of that species. And state-wise, there's less than 5. Well, that's pretty rare. So let's see what happens. It's Grant County, G1 and S1, and we're going to hit the search button and see what we get. So what we get are two species, Euphorbia reiterneri and Stellaria porcellii. And so those two, if you look at the maps, you'll see, when you click on, let's click on Stellaria porcellii, because I want to illustrate what happens when you click on the scientific name and you get the abstract. And I want to illustrate some things about it, but let's look at the map. You can see that there's only one thing there. This species, actually, I think it's known from, let me look at my cheat sheet here. And this one is known from the Pinos Altos Mountains, also known from the Chiricahuas, the Chuscas. It's the map needs to be updated, but I noticed that it's been found in the Chusca Mountains and in the White Mountains of Arizona. Those are in Arizona. Actually, those two are in Arizona, I believe, and the Chiricahuas. So that's less than 5 globally, and only one of basically one general area where it's found in New Mexico. This is a very rare plant. But, and by the way, you notice that when I clicked on the map, it just pops up right away. I don't recall that it was that easy on the old website, and also with the pictures. So here I'm going to click on a photograph. It just, all you got to do is pop it up. It's right on the abstract. It pops up. This works much better than it did on the earlier website. And then the abstract, I'm going to say a little bit about that. I've already talked about the scorecard. I'm not going to say any more. Agency status is listed. For this one, it's listed as Forest Service sensitive. But there's probably not enough information at this point to decide whether it would be state endangered. Probably not enough collections have been made for that. So it would need a lot of analysis to be proposed for state endangered. A lot of surveying in the field and so on. So, and anyway, each abstract has a description. There is a description of similar species. How do you tell it from the closely related species? What is the distribution? And the habitat specifically tells you what the habitat is, including the elevation range. And then there's some remarks that are often put into the into this abstract. Conservation considerations are written in. And this one says additional field surveys are needed. Effects of forest fires and livestock grazing on this species have not been studied. And then there's the important literature. I think that's the publication that back in 1992 that established Stellaria porcellii as a rare plant. So let me think. I think there was one other thing I wanted to do. Yeah, just one more thing, folks. You can probably tolerate this one more thing I'll point out. We still got Grant County up, but you can play with these places where you can click an X. I'm going to do it for BLM. I'm going to skip a Forest Service. And well, actually, I'm going to have to back out because I don't want G1S1. So I have to back out of this and go to the rare plant and then come back in so I can clear that, clear the drop-down boxes. And then I'm going to click BLM and Grant County. And so if you click on this and you do a search, you're going to find 3 species in the Grant County that occur on BLM lands, and they're not only occur on them, they're listed BLM sensitive. And so that helps, especially for agency people dealing with environmental impact statements and things like that. They want to hone in on what species they got to deal with. And so it's very helpful. And I think I've covered the new website long enough. And I believe I am done. I do want to encourage people that remember it said that most of the rare plant website is performed by volunteers, most of the work. But what we really need more than any other single thing is for people to get out and find these plants, document them, make plant collection. You don't have to collect the whole population, but you ought to collect some because it's a record of where those plants occur. So I'm a big advocate of collecting specimens. And so much of that, I do it all essentially as a volunteer, as do most other botanists. And, but in any event, if you do find a population, you don't collect specimens, you need to document it. The GPS, the site, and describe the site, describe the location, the habitat, count the number of plants, and report it to Natural Heritage New Mexico. You can Google that, and you can find their website. And with that, I'm done. Anybody got any questions?
So Jim, if you would go ahead and stop sharing, and so we can see everybody. Just go ahead and stop sharing. There you go.
Okay.
Tell him that Danielle is going to answer.
And I should tell you, unbeknownst to you, that Daniela has been answering questions in the chat room for you. So
Good for her.
Yep.
If she's on, we might want to have Dan, okay, you might want to have unmute and let Daniela talk to the group, perhaps. I'm just wondering, since she's been doing that, she may have some comments about things I said that may not be quite accurate, and she may want to clarify it.
it's up to Daniela.
Good idea?
If Daniela so chooses, she can unmute.
Okay, I'm here. I'm right here. I think I answered most of the technical questions that were out there with respect to the Rare Plant website. And I just want to say that the Rare Plant website and the Rare Plant Technical Council were rooted in the Rare Plant strategy in 2017 when the Rare Plant strategy was rolled out. Before that, it didn't have any structure behind it. So for example, we couldn't even fundraise for any kind of money because it wasn't anchored anywhere. It is now anchored in the Rare Plant strategy, which is anchored in the New Mexico State Forestry Division. And the entire effort on the Rare Plant strategy is a volunteer effort. And the Rare Plant, the most recent development of the Rare Plant website is a very significant effort that did not cost any money whatsoever at all, and it was basically a volunteer effort between the Heritage Program, myself for the Endangered Plant Program, and UNM Library. So we all volunteered our time, even though we got paid for that time. Nobody got paid to actually do the Rare Plant website. And as far as I'm concerned, I consider it the best website, the best Rare Plant website in the United States of America, of course.
It's a beautiful website.
Well, I would just like to comment, as I said before, it was so far-sighted thinking back in 1998 when we decided to do a website and not a book. What a difference. Really far-sighted thinking, and I agree with Daniela. It's a terrific website.
So Jim, Emily Pollum has a question. Have you been able to use iNaturalist or other citizen science apps to learn more about rare plant collections?
Location.
I just don't use iNaturalist. That's not to say you shouldn't. I haven't gotten into it. I tend to resist a lot of extraneous, well, let's just say I don't do it. I rely pretty much on going to SciNet to find out where plant collections have been made. And so I don't know anything about iNaturalist. I know Patrick Alexander uses it. And I think I've heard I think there were some complaints about iNaturalist, but I can't remember what they were, but I think it's just another useful tool. I just don't use it.
I am guessing that Emily is suggesting that you could use crowdsourcing to find more places where these plants are, and that it might be a good way to hear from the public what they're seeing.
I guess so.
Yeah, probably ought to make. What did you say, Daniela?
I said iNaturalist relies heavily on expert opinion on a photograph that was taken, and there are not enough experts in the state of New Mexico to feel sure about the verification of these identifications. I think Patrick Alexander might really be the only or the main person that uses, or botanist, I guess I should say, that uses iNaturalist, and his expertise is really largely focused on southern New Mexico. So that is a little bit of a problem with SciNet too, because it relies on of course a proper identification, but there's a little bit more backup on verification on herbarium collections rather than SciNet. SciNet is still rather amateur with respect to plants in New Mexico.
You mean iNaturalist?
Yes, iNaturalist.
You were saying SciNet, and I don't think.
Oh, I'm sorry, iNaturalist, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's my sense, and most people that know me in Albuquerque know that I really don't like trying to identify plants from photographs, mainly because I'm not very good at it. And I prefer to look at specimens.
It's not just about identifying plants, but it's identifying rare plants, and so that's a big deal.
That's right. Yeah, so that's a problem. So who asked that question? Was it Emily, I guess? But that's, yeah, that would be my concern, to look for rare plants on iNaturalist. Patrick might be able to do it, but I would have zero confidence on myself, because I just am not good at identifying plants from photos.
Emily, would you like to change? Emily, would you like to unmute and ask your other question?
Oh, sure. I don't have any more questions to ask. I put plants on iNaturalist sometimes, and I know that it's not the most solid data. I'll usually just get it to family or genus, hopefully. So I was definitely thinking it'd be more like getting leads on locations that could potentially have rare plants, depending on the plant, than actually usable data. That's all.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems in collecting data on rare plant locations in this day and age is that we no longer have people on the ground or in the agencies that are able to just go out and look for rare plants, unfortunately. I mean, the Forest Service has one botanist, and she's strictly in the Lincoln National Forest, and even she doesn't get out in the field. The Gila does not have a botanist or anybody that knows about plants to go out and into the field and document the distribution and abundance and rarity of their plants, even though the Gila National Forest has one of the highest scores on biodiversity of rare plants in the state of New Mexico.
Well,
All right.
not only,
Go ahead, Jim. I'm going to give you the last word. We're running a little long here.
okay, well, I'm just going to mention that in the Forest Service, not only of the stuff that Daniela was saying, but I've just noticed that, you can leave, you have to update the nomenclature, and they haven't updated not only the nomenclature, but the nature of their sensitive species. They're still using a 2013 sensitive species list that needs to be updated. And that needs to be done, not to mention the fact that they don't have botanists in the national forest at themselves.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And let's thank Jim for our fine presentation. And we hope to see you all in April.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope you learned a little bit. I know I got a little too carried away, but anyway, I hope you did learn something and get an idea of how we add and drop species to the New Mexico rare plant list.
Yeah, people that are passionate about things tend to get carried away about them, and that's wonderful.
That's good.
That's good.
Well, thank you.
Good night,
Hey,
everybody.
Bill, there's a familiar face.
Did a great job, Jim. Thanks a lot. I just really appreciate all your enthusiasm for looking for rare plants. You're just